Okay, Kylie Atwood was going to be here. She's with CBS News. She was going to be our moderator today, but she was pulled away because John Kerry's coming back from Iran with 3 Americans before we sit down with Iran to address the JCPOA. So she's covering Pompeo bringing back 3 Americans from North Korea. Again, something that debunks the narrative that walking away from the JCPOA would hurt us with North Korea with regards to leverage. So I will take over the moderator role. We've added a European panelist to cover the other side. We'll gang up on him. There's 4 of us. There's one of him, and it should be fun. But Jonas is here. He's a new addition to the panel. We're glad to have him. He'll give the other side of this, which is great. And I'm going to introduce the panel. First off, Mike Pregent here, Hudson Institute, and I'm happy to moderate, and I'll have a /commentator role. To my immediate left, Michael Doran, senior fellow here, has done a lot of work on this. It's good to see that events have moved him towards the walk-away position, at least last week. And I think that was based on Kerry, when we saw that there's no way President Trump was going to allow Kerry any victory here on saving the JCPOA. To his immediate left, Richard Goldberg, who's done extensive amounts of work on sanctions, and he'll be able to tell us about the right sanctions packages that are already going to be put in place, what the 90-day period looks like, and basically be an expert on how to use U.S. levers of power to get this right eventually. And to his immediate left, Jonas Parello, a colleague of mine here at the Hudson Institute, senior fellow, a supporter of the Iran deal. He was able to move some of us slightly until, again, John Kerry got out there and became the face of this. And then at the end here, from the FDD as well, Behnam Ben Taleblu. We've just recently become acquainted, very smart on Iran. I've had the opportunity to be on several panels with him and also to address congressional staff on Iran and other aspects of Iranian terrorism when it comes to IRGC Quds Force adventurism in Iraq and Syria. So with that, I'm going to do a quick scene setter. So yesterday, the president walked away from the Iran deal, and I think everybody on this panel would tell you that unless he reimposed sanctions, it would have meant nothing. And yesterday's decision to walk away and quote unquote impose the strongest and strictest of sanctions back on this regime, we're dealing with the aftermath 24 hours later. And I'm going to ask each panelist, we're going to set this panel up like we do normally. I'm going to have the scene setter, and then we're just going to go into a discussion. So I'm going to ask each panelist what yesterday's decision meant and the way forward, and to take between 2 and 4 minutes to address. You want to start, Mike, or?
Sure, yeah, thanks. I'm going to take no longer than a half hour. Though.
Roger, okay.
No, I think that yesterday's decision was, by the time he took it, it was pretty much inevitable. Because he'd started in October with this process of negotiating, first with the Hill, but then the Democrats hid behind the Europeans, right, and told the administration that they couldn't sign up for any proposal to fix the holes in the deal before the administration could come to agreement with the Europeans. To make a long story short, the Europeans were not willing to address the sunsets in the deal, which I think many sober analysts saw as a massive hole in the deal. So once they wouldn't do that, I mean, there was no deal to be had with the Europeans. And if we were going to use sanctions in order to combat Iranian activity in the region, if we impose sanctions on the central bank or on their oil exports or any other major sanctions action that we would take, it would have been interpreted by the Europeans and by the world as a violation of the deal. So I think that both from the perspective of tying our hands in terms of trying to contain Iran, and in terms of the Europeans not willing to make a deal with him, the deal was dead. Now, where does it mean going forward? We shouldn't kid ourselves. We're in an escalation now with the Iranians, and we have decided to be truthful about the fact that we are compelling them to give up the major part of their nuclear program. And that's not an easy task. That means we have to work very hard and directly to get leverage over them in all areas. I expect that at some point the Iranians are going to try to put pressure on us by threatening our soldiers in Iraq, threatening our soldiers in Syria, driving a wedge between us and the Israelis. I'm not so worried about them driving a wedge between us and the Europeans that everyone keeps talking about. And I'll just end on this point. I think the notion that the European allies are going to line up with the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians against us is just fanciful. I'm not trying to say that the Europeans like the decision. I'm sure that Jonas will have more to say about this. Like the decision that Trump made, but the choice for them is very simple. It's do I do business with the Iranian economy or do I do business with the American economy? They're going to choose the American economy, whether they like it or not. That's the choice they're going to make, and they've known it all along, right? So the condemnation we are hearing from them is mere rhetoric. It has nothing to do with the actions they're going to take. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be considerate of their feelings and think about it. But the idea that they're, in terms of their actions, that they're going to line up with their enemies and our enemies against us, it's fanciful.
Right. I'm going to go to Jonas now. I think you're the best person to follow what Mike said to be able to talk about some of those things.
Thanks, Mike. Well, first of all, thanks for adding me to the panel here as the resident European and as the party spoiler. Otherwise, these four gentlemen were ready just to sort of do a quick panel, head to the bar and high five and say, the Iran deal, we are out and we are happy. So I'll add a little bit of a different perspective also on it. Let me just start with, I mean, the bottom line that Iran should never get a nuclear weapon is something that's completely shared on both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, that was what President Macron was also saying, sort of with a lot of rhetorical swoon when he was speaking in Congress. So, I mean, so that was also sort of the genesis of the Iran deal, was saying that this should never happen. So, so I just wanted to sort of to highlight that. So there is no sort of fundamental disagreement on what is the goal of sort of negotiation with Iran, I think, among Europeans or among Americans. Second point, I think it's important here to underline that this deal is multilateral. Means that the fact that the U.S. pulls out doesn't mean there are still other signatories to the deal. There is, of course, the EU, there is the E3, the France, Germany, UK, there is China, Russia, and it's even blessed by the UN. So that doesn't. So the fact that the US withdraws doesn't necessarily mean that the deal sort of goes down immediately. So what seems to be the disagreement is really about whether you could build on the current deal to sort of make us safer and sort of get more ahead. So I think there was a recognition from Europeans as well of saying there are other activities of Iran, there are the missile program, there are sort of the terror activities in the region, that you could sort of address those in sort of add-on deals, which is basically, again, sort of the message when President Macron was here in town of saying, let's keep the current deal unless we sort of have sort of a plan B for it. So I think that was very much the European perspective. So what's going to happen now? As you saw, sort of statement from European leaders yesterday, they are intent on continuing the deal. It seems to be the same message from Iran, although of course Rouhani is sort of pressed by hardliners, Russia and China, the same. So so basically there will be, I think, a little bit of a lull right now because the sanctions, as Richard will address later, will kick in sort of August and November. So there'll be some time. So if we look at two options, there will be a best case option, which is where there is actually joint European and American work on a sort of new and better deal of saying how do we actually supplement on the missile, on the sunset clauses in the current deal on sort of Iran's malign activities in the region. That sort of best case. The sort of worst case would be some sort of minor sort of European-American standoff on sanctions. I agree with Mike that European companies are going to make their own calculations, and all the big ones will see the U.S. market and the access to U.S. financial services as more important to them than being in a sort of relatively small economy that's the Iranian. But that's also where it's going to be hard for the Europeans if sanctions kick in without waivers or anything, that the Iranians, of course, will evaluate and say if the economic benefits that were also part of the JCPOA are ended, of course, their incentive for staying in the deal is lowered. And if you saw the statement from Macron, Merkel, and May, the three M's, they had that they were going to continue sort of the economic benefits that flowed from the Iran deal. So that's, of course, going to be tested. So that's sort of, I would say, worst case, that we have a sort of a spat around whether would European governments then try to sort of protect their companies or do sort of counter legislation, which we've seen all the way, or challenge it at WTO, which we've seen sort of in much earlier cases around the Cuba sanctions. And I also want to address on sort of the sanctions that sanctions really worked back in 2010 and 2012 when they were enforcing them because other allies did them. I mean, I think a lot of, particularly if you go up to Congress, like sort of we did it. Yes, but I mean, the U.S. doesn't really trade with Iran. There's other countries that trade. So it was Europeans that during the height of Euro crisis in 2011, particularly actually Italy and Greece, so I sort of commend those two countries that completely cut down their sort of oil from Iran, even though they're in the midst of Euro crisis and we're actually facing a really hard time. So in order for sanctions this time around to work, you need that sort of transatlantic unity. So that's where, I mean, back to sort of the base case scenario. I mean, I hope you could build something in this period, but it's a big gamble basically of withdrawing from this deal here and saying within sort of 6 months we're going to get something that's way better.
Right. So I just want to say something before I go to Rich. I mean, Zarif's main complaint about the U.S. violating the Iran deal was that the U.S. wasn't encouraging economic investment in Iran, especially when it comes to Europe and other places. That was Zarif's main complaint and main issue that he cited, that the U.S. wasn't complying with the JCPOA. Well, that is gone now. And so that's interesting. But I'm going to go to Rich to address those issues. And the first question, and of course follow on Jonas there.
Yeah, I think the greatest thing that happened by withdrawing from the deal is that we've now, by nixing, fixed the fatal flaw of the deal. In my view, we've been negotiating with our European allies for months over the wrong issues. Analytically, a non-proliferation expert in an academic setting looks at the deal and assumes that both parties keep the deal forever. And under that sort of vacuum, you would say, well, we have sunsets in these provisions, they need to be extended. We haven't considered missiles, we haven't, we need tighter inspections. But even if you were able to address the issue of the sunsets in a true way, the way that the Europeans were conducting themselves in negotiations would have ensured that Iran would not actually trip any wires in the conditions set under a fix. And what Iran really wanted as a strategy long-term under the JCPOA is to regain economic strength, get all of the benefits of the deal economically, entrench itself throughout the region, build its missile program. It offered to cap its missiles at 2,000 kilometers, which is very nice, I guess, if you're beyond that range, and not so good if you're within that range.
What countries are within that range?
There's a lot of them. They're probably the same countries that seem to be applauding the fact that the president did what he did yesterday. Amazing how that works. But the fundamental flaw is that we were handcuffed to do anything about all these issues. And you would see Iran over time decide for itself when the sunset of the deal is. The sunset has a built-in sunset. It's called the Iranians choosing a time of their own to withdraw from the deal and build their weapon. And they would do it 10, 15 years from now when they're economically stronger, when they're spread out throughout the region, when their missiles are perfected, when they really feel like their R&D on their centrifuges are ready to go. That's when they have their own sunset, no matter what an agreement says. And the problem for the Europeans was they were addicted to the commercial investment corridors. And once those were reopened under the JCPOA, the Europeans, it feels like, just had a political problem at home where they couldn't tell their companies, we are going to close the door again. And so any conditions in a supplemental agreement had to assure their domestic audiences they weren't going to bring sanctions back. That's why there was negotiations over missiles that only dealt with missiles that don't exist yet, ICBMs. not the ones that do exist. Because if Iran tested an existing missile, then all the sanctions would come back and the European companies would lose their trade. The same goes on and on. That's why they didn't want sunsets. They didn't want to force Iran away from the deal. They didn't want to lose their trade. They didn't want to give Donald Trump a reason to bring sanctions back. The reason why the deal was so flawed is we gave away all of our sanctions pressure and got concessions for a limited amount of time in one limited area of all of Iran's malign activities. And we handcuffed ourselves to do anything about anything else outside of military means. What we've now done is taken the handcuffs off. We now have non-military means available to address a whole range of issues. We did not have them 2 days ago.
It also frees up military options as well. Now that, the constraints on Mattis were evident. Mattis believed that targeting any IRGC Quds Force entities in Syria would somehow derail the Iran deal. Now, the constraints have also been lifted on our military to do things as well.
I think that's right. I think there's a strategic shift that now has to occur. JCPOA put us into a period of détente. And if you kind of study the period of détente in the Soviet era, and you see what that did to all means of American power in confronting the Soviets, and the pushback you had in an interagency at all times, that you didn't want to jeopardize détente. You couldn't do things to anger the Soviets. The same was true inside the Pentagon, Joint Staff, elsewhere in our administration, and among our allies towards the Iranians. One point on the sanctions coming back. Very important to note that we have these wind-down periods that have been announced, 90 days, 180 days. Those are wind-down periods of existing activities under the JCPOA. You do not start new business. What happened yesterday at around 2:15 p.m. around the world, there was probably some surge in the internet that you could feel, because it was the number of emails coming from corporate councils to their CEOs telling them to halt all transactions immediately with the Islamic Republic of Iran. That is what happened yesterday around the world in any legitimate corporation, any financial institution, because now they have to wind down existing contracts that already existed prior to May 8th, but not enter any new ones. And if you are a financial institution, even a government-owned financial institution, if you are an insurer or reinsurer, an underwriter, you are on the hook for really harsh cutoff from the U.S. market and access to our banking system if you're caught involved in a project in Iran. And so there's going to be a very quick rush now to wind down business with Iran in the private sector. In the FAQ, the frequently asked questions the Treasury issued yesterday, you'll also see that the significant reductions of oil imports from Iran start now, not in 180 days. In 180 days, countries that import oil will be judged on how much they've significantly reduced between now and November. So the pressure on Iran starts immediately. The other big thing, I'll close with this is not happening in a vacuum. There are things that have been going on inside Iran since October when the president decertified the deal under a different piece of legislation. The currency is in free fall. It has been in free fall. So much so that the regime was so scared of their coming liquidity crisis that they made it illegal to trade foreign currencies inside Iran privately. They equated it to selling drugs and threatened people with arrest. People who were standing in line to get foreign currencies were threatened with arrest. A travel ban was issued. You can't leave the country today with an excess amount over about 1,000 euros each. You can't hold on to money at home over a certain amount. You got to put it into a government-controlled bank. And they've merged their two exchange rates, their official and their unofficial exchange rate. So what that means right now is they are drawing down on their foreign exchange reserves to avoid price spikes in imported goods. What our sanctions do, part of it, is they put all their foreign held reserves on lockdown. Any money that's paid to the regime in a foreign held account is now in an escrow account. Can't move, can't get repatriated, can't be converted to a different currency. Stays there in the local currency for local goods. Iran is going to face very quickly an extreme liquidity crisis like it's never seen before, and a balance of payments crisis like it almost had in 2013 before we gave the pressure away. That is happening at the same time as everything else. And so we're going to talk a lot about different escalation moves that the Iranians may make, what Europe's doing, etc. Got to keep our eye on the ball. This is about the rial. It's about the regime's access to currency. And the more we focus on that, the more pressure we will bring to bear, and the better the results will be.
The one thing that's interesting is the Toman was 3,000 Tomans to $1 US in 2015. Yesterday it was 7,000 to $1 US. Today it's 8,000 to $1 US. That's already significantly cut what economic incentives Europe was hoping to see as they invested in Iran. So it is in free fall. My concern as a person who looks at the region is that the IRGC will now look at places like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to be shell companies for the regime to offset U.S. sanctions. But what you said, it kind of locks that down. I want to get back to you on that point later, and I would like to follow with you.
Sure, it's a tough act to follow.
Yeah,
thanks for having me. Let me essentially begin by outing myself here. I'm a proponent of what I like to call a genuine fix to the JCPOA. And what drives me to want to be a quote-unquote genuine fixer is that, I forgot who said this quote, but whoever said it is really brilliant, that foreign policy, particularly successful foreign policy, is not about strategy or tactics or strategy or values. It's about logistics. And anyone who spent any time in this town knows that it's really, everyone brings a particular logistical competency and capability to bear. And so what a unilateral withdrawal and a full restoration of sanctions does is it complicates that logistics strain for U.S. foreign policy. It complicates it given the heavy things we have going on in the month of May, Iraq elections on May 12, North Korea talks later on, moving the embassy on the 14th, Ramadan on the 16th through 17th. There's a lot going on in May, and it's just particularly a lot for any U.S. administration to juggle. So the point of this is to say that it may not have been the best things, not in terms of strategy or values or sanctions, but in terms of logistics to make a unilateral withdrawal. But now that it happened, I think the best thing for U.S. sanctions is once you get to the end of that 180-day period, so you look at the FAQ, there's the 90-day and the 180-day wind down. Once you get to the end of that in November, the U.S. cannot prevaricate. And I don't think the U.S. will prevaricate because the way the president responded was he restored all nuclear sanctions at once. That's the sanctions found in 4 key pieces of legislations that we politically call nuclear sanctions. That's the Iran Sanctions Act as amended, which includes CISADA. That's the Iran Threat Reduction Syria Human Rights Act. That's the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. And that's also the Iran Freedom and Counterproliferation Act. So all penalties contained in here need to be reinstated en masse when we get to the end of that 180-day period, which is around November 4, November 5, 2018. And the reason we can't let a prevarication get to us and worry about, are we going to go after a European state-owned company, or are we going to go after a European bank? Are we going to go after a medium-sized European company or a multinational company headquartered in Europe that has a lot of American staff? The reason we can't entertain these different spirals is because if we prevaricate then we've done something to cast doubt over our secondary sanctions competency and capability, and then that would lead to an escalation spiral in the transatlantic community of maybe we can shelter some select European entities that do business with Iran. Maybe we can have small or medium-sized banks that don't transact in the US dollar. Maybe we can have Iranian central bank officials here a little bit more often. So it opens up a little bit in the transatlantic world the possibility for Europe to hedge against us and to toe the Iranian narrative. Now, another reason why I wasn't a proponent of a unilateral withdrawal is because I'm just not a fan of the U.S. airing its dirty laundry with the EU in front of Iran, particularly with an administration like the Rouhani administration. The reason being, the Rouhani administration from 2003 to 2005, Rouhani himself from 2003 to 2005, is the man who prevented the transfer of Iran's nuclear file from the IAEA to the UN Security Council. You'll notice when the Khatami administration changed and Rouhani was seized of his job as chief nuclear negotiator, that's when we commenced the beginning of the UN Security Council sanctions. Rouhani was the one who used the Europeans against the Bush administration to start this process much earlier. Had that diplomatic track started much earlier, I don't think we would have been in the position today with sanctions and centrifuges and the JCPOA. So beware the competency of the Rouhani administration. I would not undersell what they would do to court Europe. Now, that being said, the focus really, as Rich was saying, is on financial power now. Had we remained in the JCPOA, it would have been on what Iran is doing in the nuclear realm, what Iran is doing in the region, the attempt to fix the deal more generally. Now that the spotlight is on our financial power, the president is reinstating those 4 key pieces of legislation that I mentioned. And the spotlight is on, can the U.S. coerce or compel Iran to come back to us unilaterally? It's essentially a move reminiscent of two things done to Iran in the past. Iran will say no, 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 and then under a condition of maximum pressure, finally cry uncle. There's only 2 times I think that Iran has done that to make a strategic course correction. One is at the end of the Iran-Iraq War, when for 7 years, Iran's first supreme leader and founding father of the Islamic Republic said war, war, war until victory with Saddam. Then at the end of the 8th year, in the middle of the 8th year, he said, I'm drinking from the poison chalice, accepting the UN Security Council resolution, and I take back all that I said about the Iran-Iraq war. Powerful move. But not everyone has the charisma or legitimacy of Khomeini to be able to do that. And it's an open question right now. Can Khamenei make an about-face even if he's presented with those propitious conditions of massive economic pressure? I would also just note on the sanctions file, throughout the JCPOA's implementation period, which we now know for the US was January 2016 to May 8th, 2018, we did not take a single Annex II entity, basically an entity that the deal delisted, and relist it under existing non-nuclear authorities for non-nuclear reasons. I think if I'm more than happy to start an escalation chain with Iran, I know we can win many of those escalation spirals. But I would have started a little bit lower. You know, what we do now is we're going to be going after the CBI. That's essentially the nuclear option. That's essentially replicating the conditions under which we sanctioned Iran from 2010 to 2013. I would have gone with a smaller, medium-sized Iranian bank. I would have escalated the number of Treasury Department designations. I would have gone after the Supreme Leader's private holding company. There is no reason why, as Rich was talking about those conditions since 2017, when the Iranians were protesting on the streets saying death to the dictator, that the Trump administration did not set this useful precedent to reach into Annex II, take the Supreme Leader's holding company, which although is off limits to US persons, European and Asian banks and businesses can transact with under the deal, and say, I'm going to relist this entity under new authorities for corruption and human rights abuses and money laundering. That he could use the Global Magnitsky Act to do that. That would send a very chilling effect to the Iranian economy and would be a very useful precedent to use non-nuclear coercive measures, be consistent with the deal, and put pressure on Iran. And through that, you can get Iran to agree to whatever you would agree to with the Europeans to fix the deal. So I don't want to cry over spilt milk, but I'm part of this dying fix it through the deal camp.
Right.
That's what would have been happened. And I just want to end on a note. There's an open question right now on U.S. strategy. Rich mentioned the sanctions that would come back starting or kick in at the end of November 4th. What is U.S. strategy? What is the point of U.S. strategy? If we're focusing on the rial, is it just simply to collapse the rial? Is it to facilitate regime change, regime transformation? I'd be okay with that, by the way. We need to define what the target is for reinstating this massive nuclear sanctions regime. Is it to get Iran to come to us and propose a better deal? Is it to divorce ourselves of the transatlantic fix and no longer deal with the Europeans? What is the political use of this powerful economic weapon, which is about to be tested in new and creative ways with Iran? I'll just leave on that note.
No, those are all good. We've talked about financial power. We've talked about our economic levers. The recommendations that you made about going after Satad and going after the EIKO, which is basically the same thing, and CBI, were all conditions that Iran would have said were violations of the Iran deal, and they would have walked away. Part of that strategy would have been, well, let's do that.
Better than
they walk away.
Then we will.
We look, but again, the president was advised not to even touch any of those things by members in his cabinet. And I want to go to Mike here in a second and talk about those dynamics between Pompeo, Bolton, and Mattis, if you can think about that. But I want to go, I want to ask the panelists first before we go back to that. We talked about financial power. Now the rhetoric out of Iran is asymmetrical warfare, threats, what to do. And go! Iranian interference. Go! All right, cool. Yeah, nice try, Iran. It's not going to work. All right, I mean the regime, not the Iranian people, sorry. Anyway, so that we've heard threats, and what I'd like to ask Jonas now is, what makes Europe walk away? I mean, you know, the narrative is, and we tackled will the EU pick Iran over the United States? I think every panelist already talked about, you pick a $20 trillion economy over Iran's downward spiraling economy. You do that, but the narrative is, well, won't this just make Iran worse, a worse player in the Middle East, and won't it just make them rush to the bomb? And don't those things lose Europe? I mean, what actions would lose Europe, Jonas?
Sure. No. I mean, the deal has all its criteria, so I think there's a very simple answer to that. It depends on IAEA inspection. It depends on their verification that Iran lives up to the deal. So as long as that sort of compliance is there, I think Europe is still on board. So of course, if Iran were to decide, which sort of Rouhani in his latest statement hinted at, that they could go back to industrial scale enrichment, that would of course be a completely material breach of the deal, and it would be in non-compliance. And that would be, and that's also where I thought Ben's, and actually I think a lot of Europeans expected that initially, which was sort of what we called sort of the death by 1,000 blows to the deal, was really of using sanctions and of testing Iran by putting on people that have been removed because of nuclear for other reasons.
Right, right.
Which I also personally think would have been a sort of clever strategy, in the sense that you would have pushed Iranians perhaps to sort of say, would they then leave it? Because now it's basically the US that sort of unilaterally withdraws.
Right. Initially, when we saw the Annex II concessions, the non-nuclear concessions, we saw people like Qasem Soleimani on this, and Mohammad Reza Naqvi of the Basij. And to Mike's point yesterday, Mike had a great tweet out there that said, President Obama didn't know that his sunset clause expired, or that the Iran deal expired. Well, Kerry didn't know who Qasem Soleimani was in 2015, and what we learned from the president yesterday, that he wasn't aware that the Iran deal expired. I mean, what do you think about that? We've been talking about this for 3 years now, and
I actually don't agree with my colleagues here. I mean, we're kidding ourselves. One of the lies that the deal was based on, when Benjamin Netanyahu showed all these this huge cache of documents that the Israelis captured in Iran, the supporters of the deal immediately came out and said, "There's nothing new here." Of course, there was an enormous amount new there. New information about new technologies, information about a deception program, information about personnel, and so on and so forth. But also, when they sold the deal, John Kerry went before Congress and testified that Iran had given up its weapons program because there was a fatwa, right? So if not, do we actually believe that? Did John Kerry actually believe that? Well, he said it before Congress in testimony. And the fiction here was, even if you say that, well, Kerry was not naive, he was trying to create a political environment that would pull Iran in this direction or that direction, there was this notion, which the administration very carefully cultivated, that Iran had made a strategic decision to shift toward the West, to leave the worst aspects of its behavior behind, and so on. And that's a total fantasy. It's a total fantasy, and it's in that regard that I disagree with some of the things that you guys are saying. Because if we're to get serious about a policy of containing Iran in the region, to make them pay a price for what they're for the support of the Assad regime in Syria, the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians, for the putting missiles in Yemen that threaten the capital of our Saudi ally, and so on and so forth. If we get serious about a policy to contain that, at a certain moment, that means we're going to carry out policies that are going to cut into European-Iranian trade. The Iranians are going to cry foul, and so are the Europeans. So if we have a serious containment policy, we're going to be accused of having left the spirit of the deal. And I just think we have to be honest about that. So I actually would have preferred that the Trump administration did this differently as well. I would have liked them, first of all, to put together the containment in the region strategy, got the Europeans to sign up for that, and put pressure on the Iranians that way. But let's not kid ourselves. Sooner or later, the clash between the United States and Iran was coming, and the Europeans were going to have to be dragged to our side. They were not going to come willing, because the deal created an economic lobby in Europe in favor of the deal, and there isn't a strong security lobby in Europe, with the exception of some components of the French system. Not the Germans and not the British. They're not really signing up for a strong containment policy against Iran. And that's just the nature of the world. So let's be clear about it.
So to that strategy, good.
Just a two finger. I mean, just wanted to say that, I mean, nobody claimed that the JCPOA was going to solve everything around Iran. It was an arms control deal, and is an arms control deal, around Iran's nuclear program. It does not sort of make Iran move from a theocracy into sort of benign democracy. It does not sort of curb its missile program. It does. So all these things we're aware of, and I think Europeans are completely on board that Iran has moved in the wrong direction in those years since, and there's more to do on the, again, back to sort of, that was what Macron was also saying in Congress. This is what we're willing to sort of address as well. So
To that point, it was an arms control agreement for us. It was everything else for them. It reactivated their terror networks. It reactivated their logistical support networks. It reactivated banks that supported terrorism. It kept our Americans in prison. It did all these things. It was an arms control agreement for us, and they came to the table to get everything else.
And we unilaterally disarmed in terms of economic sanctions. Like Rich made the point about this handcuffing us. So in order to get the nuclear deal, we basically said we're not going to use any of those tools. The Iran deal redefined economic sanctions that were put on Iran for reasons other than the nuclear deal or reasons for their behavior in general, including the nuclear deal. It redefined all of those as nuclear sanctions. And that is a major flaw in the deal. So the minute if we use the legislation from last August to slap sanctions on the central bank of Iran, the Iranians and the Europeans, for what they're doing in Syria, the Iranians and the Europeans were going to say you can't do that under the JCPOA, and then we'd be at loggerheads with the Europeans.
All right, Jonas, get him, and then I'll go to you.
Well, I was just going to ask a sort of counter question a little bit to when you applaud this move, is to say I think also the allies that have been sort of strongly, U.S. allies have been strongly in favor of this, Israel and Saudi Arabia, notably in sort of the first end, is sort of the question that Mike was also hinting at, is there a broader Iran strategy in this administration? So, I mean, if at the same time the Israelis have put their red lines very clearly on Iran in Syria, but Trump is talking about leaving Syria sooner than later. So my question would just be, I mean, are those allies not sort of, if you're just being pushed out there, because you also have a president who doesn't want to start any sort of stupid wars in the Middle East, and not at all a sort of new Iran war, which, so that's sort of my counter question is, if you want to take this containment strategy all the way to the end, do you actually really think there is a strategy and a willingness to do that?
I think there's a push by Pompeo and Bolton to have a strategy, and I think Mattis is being marginalized here. There are some issues, but the one thing that I would say is when the president says, don't give me my own war in the Middle East, you get one anyway, because your enemies are still doing things. And I want to go to you and then you, Rich. Go ahead.
Well, just four important points to respond there. I fully agree with Mike. There was essentially
which Mike? This Mike or
both Mikes, but this time Doran. This time Doran.
He'll be Michael. I'll be Mike.
Michael.
Lesser Mike.
It's like Macron and Merkel, yeah.
Right.
Cute.
I fully agree. I fully agree with Michael. We should know this. There was a gentleman's agreement in Washington right after the deal was agreed to, and the gentleman's agreement was, which the pro-deal community habitually violated, by the way. The gentleman's agreement was, okay, fine, you got this limited deal, whatever. Now, the anti-deal community, or those who don't think that the JCPOA sufficiently dealt with either the nuclear threat or the rest of the Iran threat, which, by the way, has been a threat since that regime has been conceived in 1979, the nuclear group, the pro-deal group, continuously thwarted any attempt to genuinely reconstitute a sanctions architecture that could do damage to the Iranian economy on non-nuclear grounds using existing or new authorities by continuously floating this argument. That violates the spirit of the deal, or this impedes the implementation of the deal. And they won. Hands down, they won every time. Trump and Obama combined together have designated 73 entities alone, Iranian and foreign, on counterproliferation authorities. They have not designated a single Iranian bank. They were afraid. There is only one major piece of legislation that was signed and became public law under the Trump administration, which I think rightly laid out a comprehensive Iran strategy, which has not been turned into a policy. And that one piece of legislation is CATSA. There are tons of bills that actually deal with those non-nuclear elements of Iranian bad behavior, particularly ballistic missiles, that are stuck in the House, that have not been picked up in the Senate, because they are impeded by this one very powerful argument that this somehow thwarts the nuclear deal.
Right.
I would have simply liked to be in a world where we're violating the spirit of the deal rather than the letter of the deal, and let the Iranians be the ones to violate the letter of the deal. But I fully agree. The other side violated the gentleman's agreement.
Well, what's interesting is two of those entities are Asab al-Haq, an IRGC Quds Force militia in Iraq, and Harakat Nujaba, both opposed by Secretary Mattis. He's the one that's saying we shouldn't put sanctions on them because we don't want to interfere in the Iraqi government. But really, it's because of the Iran deal, the constraints of the Iran deal. This would be a violation of the spirit of the law. And absent those constraints, again, I do want to focus on what this means for a change in U.S. policy against Iran, because again, in the president's national security strategy, it states defeat ISIS and curb Iranian influence using allies. And we don't have a counter-Iran strategy in Iraq. We don't have a counter-Iran strategy in Syria. Do we have one now? I'll go to you first. You wanted to answer on the last one, and then I'll put that question to the panel. Should we have one now? Can we have one now?
Yeah, I'll try to do both. I think in terms of this idea of using the non-nuclear sanctions argument as a way to have saved the nuclear deal, Mike Doran is exactly right. This was something that was rejected out of hand.
I'd like to hear that. Can you say that again?
Was exactly right on that issue. You tweet that.
On that issue, I didn't like that bit.
Yeah, well, you got to nuance it. The Europeans rejected that out of hand. Many of us, whether you were in the quote-unquote fixed camp or the true fixed camp, which was sort of a hardliner version of the fixed camp, basically said we would accept some sort of a fix and a status quo so long as the Europeans accepted and supported our right to impose all these sanctions, namely targeting the central bank for its support of the Assad regime. And that would have cut off the commercial transactions, just like what's happening today, and the Europeans refused to accept that. The ideas that they were willing to accept on the table, I actually think were more in terms of a containment strategy in the idea that you declare sort of an armistice with Iran. As far as they've gone in the region, you can't go further. As far as they've developed their missiles, you can't go further. Whatever you've done with your nuclear program, you can't go further. After that, you'll incur the wrath of tough sanctions. Anything before that is sort of what they've gotten out of the deal so far. That, to me, is sort of what the additional framework, the supplemental agreement that was being negotiated sounded like. And I think where we are moving now by taking off the handcuffs and having full maximum pressure back, and the statements that the President Trump said when Macron was in town, and really talked for the first time openly about needing to push Iran out of Syria, that was a very welcome statement. That does mean there is an intellectual change going on. There is a strategy, being put together. And rather than, we've sort of moved from détente, there was a push by the Europeans to save détente by embracing some sort of containment. And I think we are moving into a true rollback strategy, something of a victory strategy. Now, people may not like that. People may just say, oh, it's unachievable. You'll just never get around to stop sponsoring terrorism. You'll just never get around to dismantle its nuclear program. You'll just never get around to pull out of Syria and Yemen. Okay, that's your opinion. That doesn't mean that that's not a national security priority and should be our policy and have a strategy in place to try to accomplish that. And the Iranians may collapse along the way internally, with people in the streets saying we want a different political system. And so if the outcome of a strategy is we are very clear on the goals that the president outlined yesterday, and he was very clear. He talked about the ballistic missiles and the nuclear program. He talked about terrorism. He talked about their destabilizing activities in the region. He named them. If those are our objectives, and we're going to use all parts of U.S. power to try to achieve them, and along the way, that maximum pressure in the currency crisis we talked about may actually cause the Iranian regime to implode, I mean, that will be very similar to the strategy of the 1980s versus the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so we don't have, I agree with everything Rich said, and I always agree with everything.
Say that again.
I agree with everything Rich said.
This is a
no qualification.
This is a romance emerging.
Yeah.
This is
Mike, you asked about the regional strategy. No, we don't really have one at the moment, because we're betwixt and between. Because the unspoken, unacknowledged strategy of President Obama was to turn Russia and Iran into partners for stabilizing the Middle East. They wouldn't necessarily be allies, but the theory of the Obama policy, again, none of the Obama supporters or Obama administration former officials admit this, but the goal was, the assumption was the Iranians and the Russians share a U.S. interest in stabilizing Syria, stabilizing Iraq, and fighting Sunni terrorism. And on that basis, we can come to an accommodation with them as long as we show them that we're not trying to really really undermine them. And it was based on false assumptions, their policy. But on the basis of that, the U.S. pulled back from its traditional allies. I mean, President Obama spoke openly about achieving a balance between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So we're no longer the great power. We're no longer the great power patron of Saudi Arabia. We're the mediator between the Iranians and the Saudis. The effect of that was just to recognize tacitly Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon as Iranian spheres of influence, and we pulled back from doing anything to really counter the Iranians seriously. And in fact, in Iraq, our Air Force became the Air Force of the IRGC on the ground. And President Trump came in, and he has a totally different theology. And the theology of the administration is that it's countering Iran across the region. But the counter-Iran strategy that they put together is indirect. So, which basically means we don't actually go up against them in any serious way. And you saw the contradiction became kind of public and clear a couple months ago, right after then Secretary of State Tillerson said, the strategy of the United States is to counter Iran throughout the Middle East. And then about a week later, General Votel, Commander CENTCOM, testified before Congress, and he was asked, what is the U.S. military doing to counter Iran in Syria? And he said, it is not a U.S. military mission to counter Iran in Syria. So if our strategy is to counter Iran, but in the area where they're making the greatest inroads and where they're showing where they're flexing their muscle, the greatest, Syria, we're not doing anything to stop it. So what that policy did, started by Obama and kind of continued by Trump, was that it pushed allies like the Israelis out into the front line. So the Israelis, in order to counter the Iranians, have to either take direct military action, or they have to go and make a beeline to Moscow and negotiate with Putin in the hopes that Putin will help the Israelis constrain the Iranians. Now, the U.S., under the Trump theology, the U.S. is returning to support for traditional allies. So the Israelis are getting now more diplomatic support from the U.S. than they got under Obama, and we see, a quickening of the pace and the severity of the military operations that the Israelis are carrying out in Syria, which is a good thing because they're doing some damage to the Iranians there. Right. But I look at and I'll end here quickly. Right. If you go last February, you see almost simultaneously the U.S. carried out an operation against the Russians and the Iranians, and within about 2 hours, we killed 200 Russians on the ground when they went to try to take the oil in Deir ez-Zor. At the same time, the Iranians probed the Israelis and sent this armed drone into Israel, and the Israelis responded aggressively against an Iranian airbase, or the Iranian section of an airbase in Syria. Now, those are two military actions being carried out in parallel by the U.S. and Israel, but each one was operating in support of their own red lines. In our case, we were using force protection authorities to try to, when we were being challenged by the Russians and the Iranians, and in the Israeli case, they had been probed by the Iranians. I look at that and say, gosh, what if we actually talked to each other, the American military and the Israeli military, and we had a strategy to at least contain, but I would say contain and degrade. Right. Doesn't have to be we're going to destroy Iran together operating, but if we actually had a combined policy, military policy, to cause the Iranians pain, I guarantee that they would they would feel that in Tehran immediately. They would feel it in Moscow, and our diplomatic leverage in the regional contest and on the nuclear thing would increase exponentially. But the military has, we still have, I think, the Obama mindset in the military, which is don't do anything to irritate the Iranians. They'll upset things in Iraq. They'll upset things in Lebanon. They'll upset things in things they're already doing. And there's also a tendency in the military when they see the Israelis taking actions. The line of the Trump administration is Israel has a right to protect itself. But the feeling in the military is, oh God, what are the Israelis going to do that's going to drag us in? And I think that's a counterproductive way of seeing things. We're going to get more diplomatically out of the Russians and the Iranians if we threaten them, if we show that things that they hold dear are at risk.
Right.
Than we'll get by being nice guys.
Right. The interesting thing about all of that is, I hate to go back to General Mattis here. I used to work for him, and when I worked for him, he said he went to bed at night thinking about three things: Iran, Iran, and Iran. And now he goes to bed thinking about three things: what not to do about Iran, how to not do anything about Iran, how to keep the military from doing something against Iran. And I think to your point, again, Secretary Mattis testified. Votel, Dunford, and Mattis all said the same thing. We are not in Syria to stop Iran. We're in Syria to defeat ISIS. And I'm concerned about a bumper sticker campaign where ISIS is defeated, Abadi wins in Iraq, and the Iran deal is killed. All is well in the Middle East. The biggest thing is with what Israel has done in Syria, what we've been able to do is Syria is a free fire zone. We can hit Wagner, kill 200 Russians because they're a proxy force. Erdogan can kill YPG, Kurd members in the SDF because they're a proxy force. And we can decimate Harakat Nujaba as they move on Al-Tanf in Syria because they're a proxy force. Israel's showing us, hey, you can actually hit a military. We're hitting the IRGC Quds force with impunity, and Russia's sitting on its hands. Assad is sitting on its hands. I think there's a lot of lessons there. And I think, so I'll go to Jonas, and then I'm going to go to you, and then I'm going to go to you, Rich, on this. Jonas.
Well, I'll just add a sort of the perplexed European. It doesn't sound, listening to you, as if there is a real sort of strategy.
No, there's not.
There's not.
Whether it's
There needs to be.
whether it's regime change, whether it has a military component or not. Meaning that, again, that begs the question, why would you want to do a unilateral withdrawal from the Iran deal where you don't really know where you want to go next?
To establish a policy.
And that's of course, also where it's hard for Europeans to sort of look forward in the next period of saying, where are we going to end? And as I mentioned earlier, best case scenario where we actually work together on Iran and a sort of better deal, but the time frame is very short before sanctions kick in.
I agree.
Or sort of worst case where we're like, we don't really know what you're up to, and we will sort of have to defend our companies.
I agree with you that there's not a possibility. The Europeans remind me of my ex-brother-in-law. Whenever I would make a big purchase, like buy a car, you'd come to me and say, how much did you pay for that? And I'd say, $5,000. Oh, why didn't you come to me first? I could have got that for you for $4,000, right? It's not, but it's not true, right? Whenever I did come to him, he never helped me, right? So the Europeans don't really want to contain Iran.
I do this swimming pool analogy. There's somebody drowning in the pool, and all the Europeans are sitting, tanning, and drinking drinks and saying, he's drowning. Wait, the Americans will come and save him. We're fine. We can just sit here.
All right, let's beat him up some more.
All right.
Go ahead, Ben.
Oh man, I don't know if I'm going to follow that.
Over here.
I'm a wingman. I don't know how to get labeled.
You're an honorary European today.
Yeah.
Oh God. Just a couple of things on the U.S. strategy. There is a U.S. strategy. It hasn't been translated into policy, and you don't have to go read the NSD or whatever those long 70-page PDFs. Read three things to get a sense of how this administration conceptualizes the Iran threat, or four things. The first is the October 13th decertification address by President Trump. The other is the October 13th Iran policy statement by the White House, where it layers how it sees the Iran threat: domestically, human rights, terrorism, money laundering, ballistic missile, nuclear. Then go look at the January speech, where the president said he's not going to waive the next time. And then go read the May 8th speech, the speech from yesterday, where again, the president also mentioned the Iranian people, mentioned human rights, mentioned ballistic missiles. These are the pillars of what would constitute an Iran strategy. They need to be translated into policy, and they need to have been done before substantial action was taken on the nuclear file. So that's my big gripe there. You are speaking about the threat in a proper way. You are conceptualizing the threat in a proper way. You understand where the past administration went wrong, yet you haven't done anything yet to course correct. That is the world we live in today. If the reliance now in the world we live in today is going to be on punitive or coercive economic measures, sanctions alone I don't think are going to be sufficient. They are the most powerful tool, obviously, short of war, but this has to be a paradigm approach: diplomacy, information, military, economics. And they need to support each other, and they need to be in concert with each other. And if we have local partners, like Michael was saying, whether it's Saudis in Yemen or Israelis in Syria, then we need to actually coordinate with them and not just deconflict. Because honestly, some of these Iranian wars they appear expensive, but they can actually be done on the cheap. Think about how Iran spreads its influence in the region. Why is it the country with a GDP, this is a joke by the way, but why is it the country with a GDP of Burkina Faso is ascendant across the Middle East, that it can't stop Saudi and Israel and America? It's because it makes low-cost investments that make its adversaries spend greatly to offset. Think about the cost of an Iranian ballistic missile. Now think about the cost of Iron Dome. Small cost requires high offset. Think about the cost of training a professional military. Think about the cost of training a guerrilla or a militia, taking Afghan refugees, giving them weapons, turning them into cannon fodder to supplement Russian air power. Now think about the cost of deploying a conventional professional military. Very substantial. These small things that Iran does, whether it's sending men, money, or munitions into theaters of conflict, are relatively low cost. That's why it requires more than sanctions. And we are talking about the Iran threat in a proper way. Rich is conceiving of the right, has conceptualized the right sanctions approaches. He cannot be alone. Trump cannot use sanctions alone. We need to talk about what the appropriate diplomatic response is, what the appropriate intelligence response is, what the appropriate military response is to support that campaign of financial warfare, whether it's on the real or the central bank. Because these things can be done relatively cheaply for a country that has most of its stuff on the black books, for the IRGC, which operates independent ports and independent jetties. So you're not just fighting this same perpetual war of going after shell company after shell company after shell company. You know, FDD knows a thing or two about sanctions, but it knows that sanctions are not going to be the only tool. They are the most important tool right now, but they should not be the only tool for an administration that has properly conceived of what to do about Iran.
Yesterday we saw the Iranian parliament, or today, this morning, I guess it was yesterday, we saw it this morning where they burned an American flag in parliament. I talked to a New York Times reporter.
It's called Wednesday.
Roger.
Usually it's on Friday. They changed the day.
Yeah, exactly. And they didn't have a real American flag, so there was kind of a gesture of respect. It was a paper flag. But I talked to a New York Times reporter this morning about Baghdad, and I said, have you seen similar activity? Because Iran always threatened that they would do things to the United States advisory group and military in Iraq if we walked away from the Iran deal. We've heard these threats from Shia militias. We've heard these threats from Qasem Soleimani. Yet, said all is quiet. They don't know whether there's a long game in Iraq, but I think that the religious parties associated with the Islamic Republic in Iraq are very concerned right now. And while it's inexpensive, like you said, to do things, they rely on those funds to come in, and they rely on those funds for leverage. Yes.
One quick thing is, obviously, we haven't talked about there's an election coming up on Saturday.
Yeah, Saturday.
And the outcome of that will influence a lot of the geopolitics going forward for Iraq. And that,
we have a panel here at Hudson
likely,
on the 22nd.
Yeah,
that,
everybody should go to that. But I do think that there's probably an Iranian hesitancy to do something that could tip the balance if they think right now they're in a good place. They want to try to see the outcome of the election if it's in their favor. And doing certain things that could blow back inside Iraqi politics would be bad for them at this time.
Rich,
something happens after that.
Rich, to that point, what levers do we have with the Iraqi economy? We've seen the IRGC already playing in oil, infrastructure, telecommunications, and my concern is that, again, they try to use, just to your point, it's relatively inexpensive for them to continue to pay for these militias. They're able to use the Iraqi economy to offset U.S. sanctions. What can we do against the government? What arguments can we make against the Iraqi government if Fatah does well? If the coalition between Maliki's state of law, the Hikmah party, and Fatah do well enough to control Ministry of Finance, oil, and transportation? What levers do we have?
Well, we still have billions of dollars in various reconstruction projects that are still going on there. They do need our investment. They need our involvement. They cannot allow their projects to be caught up in the sanctions architecture. In Afghanistan, we had various projects that somehow had connected due to ports that the Indians were involved in Afghan reconstruction projects, and we carved out in our sanctions an exception for that to ensure the Indians didn't get hit for helping us with a project in Afghanistan. You could imagine these kind of tailored waivers for the Iraqis as an incentive to be able to make sure their big projects that may include Iranians are not being hit. They also stand to benefit, sort of unspoken. They probably don't want to signal that to their neighbors. But as Iranian oil goes down, Iraqi oil, somewhat benefits, not just Saudi oil. That was a sort of a side interesting note back in 2012, 2013 for the Iraqis. So we do have leverage there. I do think it gets much more difficult if we truly lose control of the government and the Iranians take control of it in a proxy way.
Wouldn't they give us more power to actually use these levers if they actually take over? More of an argument to do so.
Others can talk more about it. I would think the downsides.
I'd like to talk about that.
Are more, but before you get to that, I just wanted to come back to something. I do think that we've had a strategy in place. This idea that we don't have a strategy, I just think that it's been constrained by two things. And when DoD was asked for their inputs to design the strategy in the interagency originally, it was viewed of two different sort of filters they had to go through. Number one was the JCPOA, and that already filtered their ideas to put into a strategy. And number two is a real fear of congressional backlash regarding the authorization for the use of military force not extending to that mission. You talk to people at the Pentagon, you talk to people people who are just watching the debate on Capitol Hill in the Middle East, and they think it'll never happen because of the backlash and hearings that senators take to Mattis or to others on this issue. So I do think that there's probably something that has been updated in the last few weeks, just looking at the tea leaves with no actual knowledge because it's likely classified. But if you saw General Votel went to Israel and had a meeting, and suddenly a few days later you start seeing Israeli strikes in the north of Syria, not in the south, you start seeing a little bit of an op-tempo where you get the feeling that there is some sort of CONOPS that has been put into place where the U.S. military, to the extent it believes it can, with the constraints of the AUMF, can provide intelligence, can provide real-time information, can help and support what the Israeli Air Force then goes ahead and does without U.S. troops actually doing the kinetic action. I think that there is some sort of coordination there just from seeing the open source.
Yeah, the readout I got from that was that they weren't impressed with what Votel had to say on it, and they did it anyway to prove to us that they can do it with impunity. Like,
I agree with what Rich said, but I developed, when I worked in the White House, I developed a kind of rule of thumb, which is that when somebody makes an authorities or a legal argument as to why we can't do something, it's because they don't want to do it. Because there was a great international lawyer in the State Department, last name Schwartz, I can't remember his first name, and his principle was, he's a great lawyer, which meant not just a good one. You tell him what you want to do, and then he gives you the legal justification for it. And so in Syria, we have authorities, and just force protection, which is what the ones we used to chew up those Russians. They weren't actually headed for Americans, they were headed for our allies. Force protection, you can expand that to cover your own forces, and then the area around your forces, and then your allies, and then the area around your allies, and you can do a lot with force protection if you really want to. So there is a concept behind that the military is working from, key elements of it, that goes beyond just fear of Congress, and it's that the strategic goal is defeating ISIS, not actually defeating Iran. We want to go after Iran. Indirectly, we're afraid if we go after Iran, not just that it's going to upset the JCPOA, but that the Iranians are going to upset the order in Iraq. Similarly, with regard to Lebanon, and it goes beyond the military. I mean, look, the Lebanese banking sector is flush with money. If you look, since 2006, the Israelis had a war with Lebanon. They pounded Lebanon. Now, if you're a responsible banker and you see that, you say, gosh, that's an economy that I want to invest in. No, you don't say that. You say that this is a dangerous. But yet investment has increased dramatically in Lebanon. What's that money going to? It's going to Hezbollah. It's going to Hezbollah's illicit network, and we haven't taken down a single bank in Lebanon. Why? Because we say, oh gosh, if we take down, that'll destabilize Lebanon, and this whole fear of instability. So the minute we say that, the minute it's sort of similar to the Obama principle. Obama said over and over about Syria, there is no military solution, right? So we say the United States is not going to do anything to escalate in Syria. That means what they hear, what the Russians and the Iranians hear is, we have a free hand, we do whatever we want.
Right.
Just always, on that note, it's always so funny because when the U.S. always says there is no military solution, it means the adversaries know that they have a military solution.
They have a military solution.
Right. And everything gets worse. Just real quick on an admin note, Kylie Atwood was going to moderate this panel. She's a reporter from CBS News. Those of you that showed up late, that's why I'm in this role.
But she did say she agreed with everything I've said.
Pretty much. And of course, she's covering Pompeo's return of 3 Americans from North Korea, ahead of sitting down with North Korea to negotiate a nuclear deal. Anyway, another admin note: we started about 10 minutes late, Noam, so we'll go over for questions as well. So you'll have time to ask questions. We'll go over. Anyway, so the day after, less than 24 hours since yesterday's decision, what leverage does Iran have here?
I just want to note there are things that drive Iranian escalation and provide Iran with leverage after the deal, after the U.S. walked out of the deal, and there are things that actually dampen prospects for escalation. And on the nuclear front, this is where Rich and I think, are in concert. If Iran wants to enact its major political strategy, which is to do the thing that I fear about, impede our logistics by trying to cleave apart the transatlantic community, use the Europeans as a proxy against us, fire up that economic lobby Michael was talking about, do all those things. And, by the way, to use the mechanisms of the deal, which remains in place, although you can't really have a JCPOA without America in it for too long, to get the formal condemnation of America, that whole strategy would be impeded by Iranian nuclear, quote-unquote, facts on the ground. So if Iran begins to move beyond, even though the U.S. has left the deal, the elements that are constraining its nuclear program today, which is it no longer would adhere to the additional protocol, even though it's doing that only voluntarily now, or let's say, for instance, it really ramps up its centrifuge production or takes more centrifuges out of storage, does more things in terms of testing, operates more machines in terms of vacuuming, operates more machines under vacuum. If it does really escalatory things beyond those, I think, testing measures, then they lose the Europeans. And then they lose their ace. And their ace is sicking the Europeans on us. And the moment you see an overt or covert dash to a weapon, which is a low probability, high impact scenario at this point in time, they lose their diplomatic ace. And the diplomatic ace is what's left of the JCPOA, the quote-unquote legal process there, and their ability to marshal Europe against us and kind of create chaos in the transatlantic community. So that's one dampener on Iranian escalation possibilities. Regionally, I would say if you look at the militias, in Iraq and Syria, where they're actually doing battlefield activities, the drivers of their escalation are more localized and therefore battlefield dependent. You know, Lebanese Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. You've seen them do terrorism in Argentina, Bulgaria, all around the world. But the bulk of their stuff is on the home front. It's against Israel. It's in Syria. It's in Lebanon. And it'll remain localized. So that too can dampen Iranian prospects for escalation. What can actually increase the prospects for escalation, of course, are the other things, the other M's, the men and the money and the munitions. You saw the Houthis fire a ballistic missile towards Riyadh, I think on Wednesday, this morning. You know, there's only one missile in the Houthi Saleh arsenal that can reach Riyadh. It's the one the Iranians gave them, the Qiyam-1 short-range ballistic missile. As much as Iran loves Assad, Iran has never given Assad a nuclear-capable ballistic missile. Iran has given the Houthis a nuclear-capable ballistic missile. Let that sink in. So that's one area I think we can expect to see some escalation, maybe the Yemeni theater.
To that point, an attack on Israel, does that lose Europe? Jonas, any escalation against Israel?
It's a good question, and the question is also, what do you mean by losing Europe? I mean, it's not part of the sort of...
Any sort of the rhetoric since the...
It's not part of the Iran deal, so it wouldn't, I think, make an impact on sort of that assessment. That, as I said earlier, that's an assessment based on sort of IEA and their compliance.
Right. But neither were ballistic missiles, and neither was terrorism part of the Iran deal.
I think, as you saw in sort of the one of the last European Council meeting, there was a sort of effort, particularly by the French, to sort of put forward new European sanctions on Iran's missile program. So I think there's a willingness to sort of work also with this administration on addressing some of those issues. And those, of course, depend on what the Iranians do on the ground. I wanted to debunk one thing that was here. Is a little bit sort of that European economic lobby. It's been pointed out several times. There is this sort of odd dichotomy here in the U.S. Iran is sometimes 10 foot tall, and it's like we had a panel that you were chairing where Mike Nadine was actually sitting up here saying that Iran would come to dominate the North American continent as their sort of plan. As a European, you're sort of baffled by that this is like even possible to utter. And so I just wanted to,
that won't happen before 2020.
We don't sort of see Iran as sort of that. It's a regional power. It's a small economy, as we've also said on this panel. So I also wanted to say on that sort of whole idea, there is this huge economic lobby in Europe for this. Not really. I mean, it's actually been hard to get a lot of investments into Iran. They have a lot of reasons why. Their business environment is not great. On the banking sector, they are on Basel I, we're on Basel IV and 5. And so, I mean, there are a lot of other reasons beyond sort of U.S. sanction that it's perhaps, which is why the Iranians have keep complaining of saying this is actually the U.S. behind that makes that the Europeans are not investing that much. So I just wanted to say I think the numbers aren't that great, and the example I gave earlier actually of Greece and Italy in 2011 really cutting down fully their oil supplies, that shows much more of a sort of security argument in Europe on this. So I don't really see that sort of idea that it's because we are completely sort of economically dependent on the sort of new gold mine in Iran that dictates European policy.
Rich, can you translate that smirk?
Yeah, I would just say, Barack Obama was not even a year into his presidency when he decided to walk away and break signed agreements. Remember, JCPOA was not signed. He broke 2 signed agreements with European allies. And I didn't hear a whisper out of France, Germany, and Great Britain. Because it's okay to sell out Eastern Europe so long as there's no money on the line. But when you walk away from the JCPOA, it's a total outrage. I'll just make that point. But, I think that the Europeans really kind of understate the threat of Iran. We're not going to see, like a Russia-style Navy coming up on our shores threatening us with ballistic missiles in North America. This is not going to happen. If you've ever, read these cadet cruises that they've done, they're just sort of silly. But there has been a terrorist attack on European soil in recent memory in the last 10 years. There have been terrorist plots on U.S. soil here in Washington, D.C., sponsored by the Iranian government. There have been terrorist attacks that took a lot of lives in South America. There are a lot of American families who missed their loved ones because of a series of terrorist attacks that were sponsored by Iran. And so the idea that they don't have an asymmetric reach globally, that is their strategy. And I think that is what makes them this evil empire that has their reach wherever they can find it. And we can't lose sight of that. What I'll just say is on the greatest lever that the Iranians have, I don't think it's the Europeans long term, because in the Council you need consensus. And Poland, the Czech Republic, remember that Paris and Berlin and Brussels and everyone else left them hanging when Barack Obama pulled the rug out on missile defense. And they understand that they need the United States far more against their Eastern Front than Western Europe may need us. And so their calculus of, do I stand with Brussels and Paris and Britain and everybody against the United States right now and risk my relationship with Washington when Russia is expanding? I wouldn't do that. That's crazy. And it's obviously great messaging to remind all those European countries on those borders, hey, by the way, the Russia-Iran relationship, that access is real. My enemy is your enemy. We're providing your protection if you want it. If you don't want it, let us know. So in the end, I don't think Europe is really a problem here. I think they fold rather quickly. The long-term threat is our own domestic political situation. And that is, I think, where the Iranians will always try to push buttons to see if they constrain the willingness of a U.S. president to use the true muscle of the United States to push them back. That goes into the military realm especially. It has until now gone into the economic realm. But the more that there is constraints politically on an unwillingness, a partisanship, a media frenzy of not pushing back against the Iranians, of framing them as some moderate regime that we just got to be friends with, that is their real power of success to be able to keep moving in the region.
Can I just reinforce that? I so totally agree with that. It's not just the domestic.
We're going to have our own show on Fox, by the way.
No, but there's this weird thing which I cannot explain. You need a psychiatrist, a psychosociologist to explain why the United States never holds Iran accountable. Almost never, on the small scale and on the large scale. What did we do when they killed us? They were killing our soldiers in Iraq. What did we do to punish them for that? When they put ballistic missiles in Yemen, a country that historically they have no interest in, what did we do to counter that?
We put them on the no-fire list, the no-target list.
And we do things where we we carry out reprisals that are really non-reprisals, that they allow us to tick the box and say, oh, we showed them, we did something. But in terms of actually causing them pain,
Right.
we don't. And we build them up actually to appear like they are 10 feet tall or 20 feet tall. They have an economy the size of what, Maryland, the state of Maryland, or Denmark. Is it Denmark?
Right.
Right. I mean, imagine if an American Secretary of State spent as much time as John Kerry did on the Denmark problem, right? I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy.
Right.
It's like, wow, you know what? What are we going to do about Albania? How come we're not part of how come we're not focusing on that Albania problem? If we brought the full power to bear of the United States and said we're going to cause them pain and we're going to make them, we don't have to go have a regime change. We don't have to go. We don't have to go attack. We don't have to say military first. But we say we are going to bring the full power of the United States to bear to change the calculus in Tehran. We have never ever done that.
We have an example of doing that now with North Korea. The levers we're using with Russia and China to get them to put pressure on North Korea is an example. One thing, and I'll get back to you.
You don't want to be moderator, do you?
Yeah, I was supposed to be on this panel, so But what I wanted to say is this argument that Iran was never cheating on the JCPOA. That's the argument we hear on the other side. They were never cheating, yet they were cheating on existing UN Security Council resolutions with ballistic missiles, with terrorism out in the open. So I just find it fascinating, this argument that they weren't cheating in the shadows, but they were cheating out in the open for everyone to see. And they continue to do that. And again, it's the U.S. levers. Again, it's a paper tiger, Iran is. It's becoming friendless, and it's broke. And this is the day after. This is where we usually don't get it right.
And Prime Minister Netanyahu gave anyone who wants to make it the evidence that they are in violation of the JCPOA and the NPT. There's a very good argument to be made there. And so if you want to make that argument, it's there to be had.
Well, yeah, you protect these 5 sites under the JCPOA, and you conduct all the cheating in these 4 sites that we can't look at. But to your point.
Well, just to kind of begin with what you were saying, the administration hasn't to date used some of the strongest cards about Iran violating UN Security Council Resolution 2231 that it could have. In the annex of that resolution, there is an arms transfer provision and a ballistic missile testing provision. Obviously, the ballistic missile testing provision is not as strong as the one found in 1929, which was from 2010. But nonetheless, it still exists. And Iran, according to my calculations, has launched as many as 23 ballistic missiles since inking the deal. That's inclusive of surface-to-surface missiles only, not anti-ship ballistic missiles, inclusive of tests and operations. If you were really holding Iran's feet to the fire, that number should have been 0. That number should not be 23. On the arms transfer stuff, at least 5 shipments of things, AK-47s, rocket-propelled grenades, anti-tank weapons, have been intercepted going to Yemen. God knows what hasn't been intercepted to Yemen, as well as the short-range ballistic missile. That's a violation of Annex B. What have we done about that? Every time we brought it up at the UN, it was thwarted. The panel of experts, which comes out once a year on the Yemen resolution, 2214, comes out and occasionally says, yes, okay, there's evidence that Iran did not halt the transfer of these missiles. But that's it. We just kind of had a perfunctory 300-word PDF and moved on with our lives. And then just to Michael's point about not pushing back on Iran, look, if you're an Iranian security planner, look at the laundry list of evidence you have. You have founding Lebanese Hezbollah, the barracks, the embassy bombings, Khobar Towers, all the EFPs in Iraq. No substantial response. Why would you change your calculus otherwise? And if you're an American security planner, what you should look to is the Iran-Iraq War. When selectively Iran is militarily pushed back, it does change its behavior. In 1984, Iranian F-4s in the middle of the Iran-Iraq War would buzz Saudi airspace. Once one of those F-4s was shot out of the sky, for the remaining 4 years of the war, no Iranian F-4 entered Saudi airspace. Look at Operation Praying Mantis. Relive some of the battles in the Persian Gulf that happened. Why Iran's conventional navy, which they inherited from the Shah, became so bloodied and so aged so quickly. Because they went up against the U.S. Navy.
I want to open it up to questions now. Again, we're going to go along, and I'm going to take them in batches of 3. So we'll start with you first, Laurie, and then we'll go to you, sir. And then we'll go to you.
Laurie Milroy, Kurdistan 24. My question comes from something that the panelists, including Mike, mentioned, which is that as tensions rise with Iran, one way that Iran is likely to respond is by threatening U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria. There is a colleague, Intifad Khanbar, an Iraqi American, has made a cogent argument that coalition troops, the bulk of them in Iraq, should move to Kurdistan, which the U.S. says is part of Iraq. They would be safe there and in proximity to the Islamic State, which is mostly now in the disputed areas on the Kurdistan border. Does that sound like an interesting and even reasonable notion to you?
I'd actually defer to Mike. Mike knows the sort of military situation on the ground much better than I do.
I would say,
Iraq.
I would make the argument. We'll answer your question really quick. Make the argument. If there is a one Iraq policy that everybody in our State Department and Department of Defense says Iraq is one country, then it shouldn't be controversial to move the U.S. training and equip program to Erbil, especially when the Shia political parties in Baghdad are asking for an invisible footprint by the U.S. and a maintenance of the U.S. training and equip program. Move it to Erbil, where it will be out of sight from the Shia political parties. Have it build a Sunni Arab and Sunni Kurdish force that can go after ISIS, because it has not been defeated. It has simply had territory taken away, and deny a permissive environment for our IRGC Quds Force militias in the north. It's very simple. If there is a one Iraq policy, moving something to Erbil should be okay, because they're Iraqis, right? It's controversial. I don't know why. Every party, from the moderate Shia political parties to the extreme ones, are wanting the U.S. to exit. And we're not going to exit because we have to defeat ISIS. If we're using that argument to stay in Syria, General Votel says we're not in Syria, we haven't been invited in, but we're there to defeat ISIS, then you stay in Iraq and you defeat ISIS because it hasn't been defeated. Yes, sir.
Working? Yeah, Michael Kurtzig, who used to work on Iran many years ago on agriculture. Two quick points in question. Yesterday was May 8th. I think we remember May 8th, 1945, the end of one war. The question I have to you, and it sounds to me a little bit from what you're saying, that we're declaring war in Iran now. Not, from all the words that I hear, this sounds like a declaration of war against Iran. And the second point is, how much of the sanction money is still left? $150 billion.
No.
I don't know what actually was. Is that also under the new sanctions? Has that all been spent and so on?
The Iranian people said it's been spent, and I think there's an acknowledgement that it's gone. And there's an acknowledgement, I think we're acknowledging that Iran has been at war with us since 1979. But to the panelists there on that one. And one more question, then I'll put those questions to the panel. Yes, sir.
As the most vocal advocates of the JCPOA, the previous administration kind of feed the Iranian regime's arguments for them now. Mike, yesterday you tweeted about President Obama's message and essentially that the deal was not set to expire. My question is what planet is that kind of philosophy or that thinking from, and what what's the kind of thinking behind that belief, and why does that exist, and how are we not dealing in the facts about honest facts about the deal when we talk about
All right. So put questions 2 and 3 to the panel. So I'll put questions 2 and 3 to the panel.
I can take the first one. You want to take the second one?
Yeah, sure.
So the first one on the sanctions issue, I think you covered the first part of your question. On the sanctions issue, remember the sanctions relief, we calculated that in a couple of different ways. Number one, there was this, as President Trump likes to talk about, this, pallets of cash that were delivered. That was, a limited amount of money. It's a lot of money to a normal person, but, on the context of the $150 billion and their annual sanctions relief, that was sort of a little present icing on the cake. The amount of money that they were able to repatriate immediately out of all these accounts that I talked about before that are now on lockdown, they were finally able to go grab their money and bring it back, which is what they really needed. They were largely able to start doing that during the interim agreement. As we eased up on some of the sanctions, they were able to start transferring the money a little bit. Once the deal was inked, they really were able to repatriate all that money. That's a one-time repatriation. It's not an ongoing sanctions relief. If you take some of the calculations of $15 billion a year being spent in Syria, whatever else their budget is for the IRGC and for the missile program for Yemen, all that, over time that money starts evaporating, especially given their other budget needs internally. Their annual sanctions relief of just being able to do the business, to be able to grow their economy, to be able to get the Europeans and others to increase trade and investment, that obviously goes away. Unfortunately, we don't get to recoup all the money they already took and brought back. The good news is that this government is so corrupt and so incompetent that they have totally wasted all their sanctions relief, which is why they were already in a currency crisis. So that's the good news if you're waging financial war on the regime. The bad news is, can't get the pallet of cash back.
On the war question, I guess I just two observations. One is the one that Mike made. They're making war on us, and we have chosen to ignore it, which is not the same thing as us declaring war on it. But secondly, the JCPOA and the Obama policy was appeasement and retreat. And so appeasement and retreat that it was presented dishonestly as a change of heart by Iran. It was a appeasement and retreat by the United States, which the administration spun as a change of heart by Iran and a desire after the election in 2013 of Rouhani to open up a new page with the West and so on. And that's why President Obama yesterday said that this JCPOA is a permanent deal and it permanently prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. If you believe that, there's no basis for serious conversation. Right? That the whole meaning of what the Prime Minister Netanyahu revealed last week is that no, it hasn't prevented them. They have just adapted a new strategy for achieving it. So when you end appeasement, it is going to be presented by appeasers as a declaration of war and plunging the United States into war. And I would just ask you, how are we going to achieve the goals that every president since Clinton has said we have with respect to the Iranians? That they will not get a nuclear weapon and that we will contain them in the region. And President Obama presented us with a false choice, that there's some kind of diplomatic magic and fairy dust that we can sprinkle on the Iranian relationship and everything will magically fall into place and we don't ever have to lift a finger militarily or otherwise or ruffle the feathers of our allies in order to get the goals that we said we achieve. That's just false. If we want to achieve those goals, then we have to get tough. And I'm just saying, let's be honest about it.
I'll take 3 more questions and then put it back to, we'll go to this gentleman, then we'll go back to you, sir. And then this, how many? 3? Okay, 1, 2, 3, perfect.
Hi, Louis Morano. A few years ago, when the deal was being negotiated, the word was that the French were being much tougher than the Obama administration. My question is any of that recoverable or is that passé? Is that just gone up in smoke?
Partially recoverable. And you can already see it when Macron came last week to Washington. He was triangulating between the Germans and Trump. He didn't come and say, "I'm coming to convince President Trump not to simply say not to leave the JCPOA." He already factored in the fact that Trump might leave, and he came and said, "I'm looking to talk to him about 4 pillars. The JCPOA is just one of them, and then there are these other 3 pillars," and that set him up. That put him in a position then. After Trump made the decision to leave, he can say, well, we are engaging with the Americans on all of these different pillars of our relationship. That way he's not sitting on the sidelines just grousing like my ex-brother-in-law to say, you should have talked to me, why didn't you come to me, and so on. The French have always been the most serious about the security threat that Iran represents, and in particular, the security threat that its nuclear program represents. It goes in this order: the French, the British, and then the Germans, who are simply not in the security game. That's why they were President Obama's favorite interlocutors on the issue, because Angela Merkel never called up Obama and said, I want you to use military force to put pressure on the Iranians. Now, Obama destroyed the coalition that we had. We had a bipartisan Republican-Democrat coalition to contain Iran, and we had a U.S.-European coalition. And Obama destroyed those. That coalition doesn't exist anymore. And the French, and the Europeans in general, they feel whipsawed because they were told one thing by George W. Bush, and then Obama came and told them the opposite. And Obama unilaterally negotiated the JCPOA, but presented it as great multilateral diplomacy by the United States. I mean, they came up with this whole line, a total fiction, that the sanctions architecture against Iran was starting to erode and to be destroyed because we were too hardline, and we had to make these concessions to the Iranians in order to keep the Europeans on board. So it was irresponsible unilateralism by Obama masquerading as multilateralism. What Trump is doing is responsible unilateralism, but we've whipsawed the Europeans. We have to be honest about that. If I were them, I too would look at Washington and say, "What's wrong with you guys? You say do X, we do X. Then you say do Y, we do Y. Now you come back and say we're going to go back to X. This is crazy." So, but we can recover some of that with the French, some of it.
The French dynamic that's interesting here, and I'll come to you, Jonas, is that there's a French dynamic that was a nail in the coffin for the Iran deal, and that was the French-speaking John Kerry. There was no way the president was going to give John Kerry a victory here when he was the face of those supporting the Iran deal. All right, go, Joe.
Well, savor the moment, Mike. I actually tended to agree with what you were saying, at least until sort of the last minute riff analysis of. So it's completely correct. I mean, the French were in negotiation tougher. They've also, I think, used that sort of with the Trump administration of saying we were not necessarily completely in favor and could see the flaws in this deal. And that's exactly why Macron came with this sort of new structure. Of course, the problem is that now, by the unilateral withdrawal, one of those four pillars have been sort of unplugged a little bit. And the question is back to my early sort of best case, worst case scenario. Best case scenario, we actually use that time for a type of new negotiation, but that depends on a lot of other factors, and time is short. And worst case is it sort of drifts into a little bit of a sort of tension over sanctions when they get reintroduced.
All right, last two questions. This gentleman here, and then this gentleman back over here.
Stephen Morris, I'd like to ask Mike and any of the other panelists, in fact, how would you operationalize a policy of either rollback or containment militarily of Iran in Syria and Yemen? And what would the difference be between rollback and containment? How would we know the difference? Second question, is it not a fact that we can't institute any policy of containment or rollback of Iran in Iraq because of the political complexity, and we could only institute it if we were attacked by Iran?
Okay. And then this question here.
As much as you can shed light on, I'd like to understand what's occurring or what's occurred in Secretary Mattis's thinking about Iran. So 2 years ago, as you said, he went to sleep thinking the biggest threats to the U.S. are Iran, Iran, Iran. Now he sort of appears like the dove in this administration. And do you think it's sort of that he is just trying to provide an intellectual counterweight, kind of devil's advocate, or has he had a profound strategic recalculation?
I would just say that every devil's advocate position Secretary Mattis has taken has advantaged the IRGC. And I'm okay with a team of rivals, but a lot of us that's worked with General Mattis, and it pains me to say this, don't recognize this man, especially when it comes to Iran. I want a Chuck Norris with one-liners and a Chuck Norris with actions. I want Mad Dog back. I think with the Iran deal gone now, it should unconstrain Mad Dog. Again, if a Secretary of Defense doesn't want to put Americans in harm's way during his tenure, he's forcing the next Secretary of Defense to do exactly that. And we'll be behind the eight ball, so to speak, 6 months to 1 year.
I can make the Mattis argument. I think sympathetic argument. I'd say the U.S. military looks at the last, since 2001 to now, what is that? Last 17 years, sees an enormous, sees the civilian leadership from both parties coming at them with grand solutions for the Middle East. huge expense of blood and treasure, which and nobody has paid a higher price than the military, and very little to show for it. And so there's a kind of tendency to say, you know what, don't come to me with your new solution for the Middle East that's going to involve a big, or even a small sacrifice by our boys. And especially when, for most of this administration, there's been the tension with North Korea. And I can just imagine, I'm not saying I have any knowledge of this at all, but just having been in those kinds of environments, I can see Mattis sitting around the room and people from the State Department and elsewhere saying, let's flex our military muscle in the Middle East, and that's how we'll get what we want. And he immediately thinks, we're about to start a war in North Korea. Can I do it one war at a time? Right? That's those kind of attitudes, and especially after the military's gone through a lot of because of all of the budgetary constraints that have been placed on the military. That he probably doesn't feel that he has the greatest force that he wants to the force that he wants to go get involved in a major escalation with the Iranians. So I would just say, for very understandable, justifiable reasons, there's a lot of caution in the military now. But I just repeat myself and say that my argument is very simple. That caution will not allow us to achieve the goals that everybody says we want to achieve. So if we're actually serious about the goals we're announcing, that's not how we're going to get it.
I just want to say something on that. Mattis became Mad Dog in Afghanistan and Iraq as a combatant commander. And I would say that instead of listening to civilians tell Mattis what he should do in Iraq and Syria, we should say, why don't you use the Mattis solution that we used during the surge? You built a Sunni force in Anbar that became the Awakening, that was mirrored all across Iraq, that became the Sons of Iraq, that not only decimated al-Qaeda, but also curbed Iranian influence and targeted the Quds force. Mattis has the solution. When Mattis was named Secretary of Defense with McMaster, they were surge guys. They saw this work. They were the right team to go in and be able to do this. And I don't recognize.
Well, that's the answer. The answer, if you want to try to find a midway answer between the caution that I described and what Mike is describing, is allies. That's why I am so interested in the relationship with the Israelis, because the Israeli problem, when the Israelis go to target the Iranians, is not the Iranians, it's the Russians. So if we backstop the Israelis against the Russians and we deter the Russians, then we can unleash the Israelis to cause pain on the Iranians. But the cautious attitude of the military is, wow, I don't want to do that, because that'll suck that's going to suck the U.S. into another conflict that has no end to it. We shouldn't blame it all on Mattis, because Donald Trump himself. Donald Trump said, "I'm getting out of Syria." Right? He's got one leg in and he's running for the exit. So the president is telling the Secretary of Defense, don't get me sucked into a major conflict in Syria. So that just increases the caution.
And again, Trump can't criticize Obama for leaving Iraq in 2011 and creating ISIS, and then claim victory in Iraq and Syria, saying that ISIS is defeated, and allow ISIS 2.0, which it already is, to reemerge, a security backslide. So there's a lot of things. You're right.
And he can say it, he just won't be right.
Right. And the good thing is another Marine, General Kelly, kept Trump in Syria, rightfully so. Yes.
I'll venture into, I think the quick answer is Mattis is defense secretary. He's not a CENTCOM commander. And if you look at the national security strategy, it highlights great power competition. What is it to rebuild U.S. readiness for great power competition with China, second degree with Russia? And that figure back to sort of how high we rate Iran doesn't just fill in that big space. So that's where I think he, to a certain degree, completely fulfills the role of the defense secretary. First point. And second, I would add something on the French and the sort of, which comes to the Syria piece, is that the Europeans, particularly the French, but are very interested in the U.S. stays on in Syria. And I think, therefore, actually, the Iran card comes into play. That
Right.
Macron was also convincing Trump, if we want to do more on Iran, part of that is staying in Syria. Although for the Europeans, it's mainly about that if we need to do stabilization, because if we don't do stabilization, then we should return to refugees. There are 1 million, and Germany will not return. But I mean, so the reasoning is different, but it does make for sort of certain convergence about saying that the reasons every European, no, you do not convince Donald Trump about saying you should do a nation building program in Syria. That's why you should stay. But saying, but hey, think about Iran, which is particularly what Macron cleverly did. So
The French have been consistent always in seeing Assad and Iran as a major problem in Syria. The Germans are inclined to reach out and negotiate, but the French always have said the major problem, and that's another way that we align with against Iran with the French.
And the good thing is Russia is set on its hands. I mean, I think to your point about what will Russia do and what pressure do we need to put on Russia, Russia's set on its hands. It has not launched one missile in defense of anything we've targeted, whether it's been Assad's chemical munitions or this limited response, but also what Israel's done. So I think, again, Russia is in Syria for Russia, not to protect the Assad regime and not to protect Iran. And you wanted to say something.
Yeah, just on the Yemen equation, you're looking to roll back or contain or counter Iran. Iran has strategies, Iran has values. The Islamic Republic looks to, use both to get its hands in the region, but it's also a highly opportunistic actor. So I would just say, define the end state in every theater of conflict with Iran, know which ones you can bait and bleed Iran into, know which theaters Iran has sunk more money into and more men into, and know which ones are of greater value and lesser value to Iran. So definitely Syria takes precedent over Yemen. Look at the investments, measure by those three measures, men, money, munitions. And then in theaters like Yemen, define a political end state and work with your partners who are already in that theater to get to that end state. Make sure that the UAE and the Saudi mission are on the same page. Make sure that you have the legal authorities under UN Security Council Resolution 2214, as well as with respect to CENTCOM and the Navy, to make sure that you can increase the pace of interdictions. Make sure that nothing is getting through Oman. Establish a channel with Oman. Make sure that there's no land route for any Iranian weapons getting into Yemen. And make sure that the Houthis have an exit, because the Houthis are not yet a full-blown Iranian proxy. The day that happens, you're going to have to write off the Yemeni theater, kind of like what we fear about a lot of Shiite politicians in Iraq today.
Out of respect for everybody's time, Rich, I'm going to give you a last comment.
Yeah, I was just going to try to address the rollback idea. I think a lot of comments that have been made on Syria have been excellent. Probably a combination of the two mics gets you pretty close to the equation. Take your point on Iraq, though I do believe that we have a lot of leverage on the border with Syria, and that any convoys we see as part of the land bridge is a point of weakness for the Iranians that we, just because we own the airspace, can intercept. I think that we have cargo flights that continue basically unabated that keep coming from Iran into Syria. These have to be interdicted. I mean, it's just crazy. I think with the sanctions coming back on the airline industry, I think that's a good first step, but we're going to have to go further than just economic sanctions to actually interdict those cargoes. And then more to Behnam's point, the Yemen theater is, I think if you're the Saudis, it's been fairly embarrassing. And I respect them. I've been there. I've talked to people who are working the mission, but it should not have taken this long to accomplish what they need to accomplish. Part of that is a lack of ISR provided by the United States. That was withdrawn by the Obama administration in the final year. Some of that's come back online from what I understand. But, I mean, the Saudis complain of just not having 24-hour coverage on their ISR. That could be right, but there's also some basic questions. Why aren't we doing intel that's just targeting supply routes that Behnam's talking about, sea routes, land routes? Why aren't we interdicting those? These are some of the things that are relatively simple for the United States military, even if it's just intel support to our allies to accomplish. The fact that it hasn't been done is just a big question mark to me.
It's Secretary Mattis is the one that doesn't want to do that. I'm happy to say that. I don't like saying it, but it's just, he's been the voice that has said we shouldn't do these things.
I'm trying to get you a job in the Defense Department.
No.
Making it hard.
Well, there were 3 red lines for Mattis. One was Tillerson being fired, the other one was Bolton going into the NSC, and the other one was walking away from the JCPOA. So we'll see if Mad Dog returns or whether Mad Dog goes to Amazon. All right, that's all the time we have. Sorry to go over. I apologize, but I hope you found it an interesting panel today. Thank you.
Yeah.
You like the little